Have you ever believed something so completely that you never thought it needed to be tested? Not debated, not questioned, not challenged by reality, just accepted. Many people grow up believing that kindness flows downhill from power, that generosity is a side effect of wealth, that those who struggle simply do not have the luxury of helping others. It sounds logical, almost scientific. When resources are scarce, people protect themselves first. That idea has traveled quietly across the world, repeated in business schools, whispered in political circles, nodded at in expensive restaurants. Poor countries are warm, but limited. Poor people are good, but cautious. That is what many assume, as if the entire world has already agreed. There is also a subtle insult hidden inside that belief, one rarely spoken out loud. That places like the Philippines survive on smiles, not substance, on faith, not competence, on emotion, not action. People say it without malice, as if it were a harmless observation. They say Filipinos are kind, but only because they have nothing else. They say help there is shallow, temporary, unreliable. Some even say it is rehearsed, part of a culture of survival rather than genuine compassion. And strangely, these ideas are often repeated by people who have never slept a single night on Filipino soil. What makes this belief more dangerous is that it feels universal, as if the world has already made up its mind, as if history itself has stamped approval on the idea that dignity belongs to the powerful. Even respected voices have echoed it. A celebrated American economist once remarked that generosity increases with GDP. A famous philanthropist casually joked that poor nations cannot afford empathy. These words travel far, shaping perceptions without ever meeting the people they describe. And so the insult lingers quietly, unchallenged, floating above an entire nation. Richard Hale believed all of this. He had no reason not to. Born into comfort, rising into extraordinary wealth through technology and private equity, Richard had spent decades surrounded by polished sincerity. Doors opened before he knocked. Smiles appeared before he spoke. Help arrived before he asked. He told himself it was respect, but somewhere deep inside, he knew it was his name, his net worth, his perceived importance. Still, he accepted it as the natural order of things. This is how the world works, he would say. People respond to power. But what if that belief was wrong? What if the purest form of compassion appears when there is nothing to gain? What if dignity does not come from status, but from values rooted so deeply that they survive even in hardship? These questions did not come to Richard through philosophy or debate. They arrived through restlessness, through a growing discomfort that followed him from New York to Zurich to Tokyo. No matter how luxurious the city, something felt missing. Every interaction felt transactional, measured, cautious. It was during a private conversation with a friend, someone far removed from wealth, that an unexpected idea surfaced. Not an experiment, not a documentary, not a public spectacle. Just a quiet decision. Richard would step away from everything that identified him as powerful. No assistance, no security, no recognizable clothing. No credit cards that could open doors. He would go somewhere the world often underestimates, somewhere known more for warmth than wealth, somewhere faith still shapes daily life. That place was the Philippines. He did not go as a savior. He did not go to give. He went with a simple, almost unsettling question burning in his mind. If I have nothing, who will help me? And more importantly, why? Richard arrived without ceremony, without the invisible armor that had followed him his entire life. No assistant rushing ahead, no hotel concierge greeting him by name, no credit card that whispered privilege with every swipe. When he stepped out into the humid air of Manila, carrying a worn backpack and wearing clothes chosen precisely because they meant nothing, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Vulnerability. Not the kind discussed in leadership seminars, but the real kind. The kind that leaves you exposed to how the world truly sees you. For the first time in decades, he was just another foreigner standing under flickering fluorescent lights, unsure where to go next. And almost immediately, the assumptions he had carried for years began to press against him. This was supposed to be the hard part. The place where help would be conditional, where eyes would scan him for value before offering a word. He prepared himself for indifference, even suspicion. That is what experience in other parts of the world had taught him. Because Richard had tried this before, in quieter ways. In Europe, he once traveled anonymously for a week, dressing plainly, booking cheap accommodations. People were polite, efficient, distant. Help came, but always measured, always cautious, always accompanied by a glance at a watch. In Japan, kindness was immaculate but formal, wrapped in rules and distance. In the United States, the land of his birth, he felt the sharpest contrast. When he removed the signals of success, conversations shortened. Smiles faded faster. Assistance came only after explanations. Those memories weighed on him as he navigated the unfamiliar streets of the Manila. He felt the fatigue quickly, the noise, the heat, the uncertainty of not knowing where he would sleep that night. His phone battery died. His directions were half remembered. Hunger crept in slowly, not dramatic, just persistent. It was in that quiet discomfort that his first real test emerged. He stood outside a small convenience store, hesitating, counting coins in his hand, realizing they were not enough. A minor problem, insignificant in his former life, suddenly felt heavy. He must have looked lost because someone noticed. A middle-aged man, worn sandals, kind eyes, approached him without hesitation. No questions about status, no cautious distance. Just a simple sentence spoken gently in clear English. "Are you okay, sir?" That moment unsettled Richard more than he expected. Not because help was offered, but because of how naturally it came. No performance, no expectation. The man did not wait for an answer before pointing him toward a nearby eatery and offering to walk with him. Along the way, he spoke about his family, his work, his faith. He asked nothing in return. When Richard tried to decline, embarrassed by his situation, the man smiled and said something that would linger. Sometimes, we are the ones God sends. As the days passed, similar moments accumulated. A nurse at a public clinic who stayed past her shift to help him navigate paperwork. A woman near a church who noticed his confusion and quietly offered directions and a bottle of water. In the evenings, he would sit near a small parish, listening to hymns echo into the street, watching people bow their heads not in despair, but in trust. The presence of faith was not decorative here. It was lived. And still Richard resisted drawing conclusions. He told himself these were coincidences, exceptions. He reminded himself of the world he knew, where generosity had limits. But somewhere beneath that resistance, a question began to press harder with each encounter. What if this place operated by a different logic? What if the Philippines was not offering help despite hardship, but because of it? The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. It arrived quietly, almost respectfully, as if the Philippines itself was careful not to overwhelm him. Richard began to notice that his days were no longer driven by anxiety about survival, but by an unfamiliar sense of being seen, not evaluated, not measured, simply noticed. One morning, he found himself inside a public hospital corridor, sitting on a plastic chair beneath a slow, spinning fan. The building was old, the paint chipped, the hallway crowded with families waiting patiently. This was not the kind of place wealth usually hides in, and yet there was a calm there that unsettled him. A nurse approached, her uniform creased from long hours, her eyes tired but warm. She spoke gently, explaining procedures he had not asked about, noticing his confusion before he voiced it. When he apologized for taking her time, she smiled and said something that landed deeply. "If you are here, then you matter." That sentence followed him for days. In the past, help had always been framed as service. Someone was paid, someone was assigned, someone was responsible. Here, it felt different. Assistance did not flow from obligation, but from instinct. When he traveled south and spent time near Cebu, he met students who invited him to sit in on a lecture simply because he looked curious. The classroom was modest, the air thick with heat, but the passion was unmistakable. These young Filipinos spoke about their dreams with clarity and humility, not entitlement. They spoke of serving their communities, of giving back, of faith-shaping ambition. Richard listened, silently comparing this to the polished apathy he had seen in elite institutions elsewhere. What struck him most was not grand gestures, but the smallest details. The way people shared food without counting portions. The way strangers remembered his name after meeting him once. The way prayers were offered not as performance, but as reflex. In one neighborhood, a family invited him to join their evening meal. The table was small, the dishes simple, yet everyone insisted he take more. When he protested, they laughed softly, as if the idea of leaving someone hungry was unthinkable. His skepticism began to crack, not dramatically, but steadily. He started to realize that the kindness he was witnessing was not accidental. It was cultural. It was spiritual. It was rooted in something older than money. In the West, success often teaches people to guard what they have. Here, hardship had taught people to share what little they possessed. And they did it with dignity, not pity. One evening, as he sat outside a church listening to hymns drift into the street, Richard felt a weight he had carried for years begin to loosen. Not sadness, recognition. He saw families kneeling together, hands clasped, children leaning into parents. Faith was not an escape here. It was a foundation. It shaped how people treated one another, how they understood suffering, how they defined wealth. For the first time since arriving, Richard stopped asking whether the help he received was real. He no longer searched for hidden motives. Instead, a quieter question took its place, one that unsettled him far more deeply. What if everything he had been taught about value was incomplete? What if the Philippines was not the exception to the world's rules, but the reminder of what those rules were meant to be? And as that realization settled in, he felt something he had not felt in years. Hope, not for himself alone, but for humanity. By the time Richard realized something inside him had changed, it was already too late to turn back. The transformation was not dramatic. There was no single speech, no sudden revelation announced out loud. It unfolded through repetition, through ordinary days that quietly redefined what he believed about people. He began waking up not with anxiety, but with a strange calm, as if his body had learned it was safe here, even without protection. He spent more time walking, less time planning. He learned the rhythms of the neighborhoods, the way mornings began with greetings and evenings softened into shared conversations. Children waved without fear. Elders smiled without suspicion. People asked how he was doing and waited for the answer. No one rushed him. No one treated him like a burden. In places where he expected to feel invisible, he felt held. One afternoon, a sudden rain poured down, heavy and unapologetic. He took shelter under a narrow roof with several strangers. No one complained. Someone laughed. Another offered him space. A woman quietly handed him a towel she had brought for herself. That simple gesture unraveled him. In a world where inconvenience often breeds irritation, here it produced generosity. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Faith surrounded him, not as doctrine, but as presence. Before meals, heads bowed naturally. In moments of difficulty, prayers rose instinctively. It was not loud or performative. It was steady. Richard began attending evening mass, sitting at the back, observing more than participating. He watched people arrive tired from work, faces worn by responsibility, yet something lifted as the prayers began. This was not denial of hardship. It was resilience shaped by belief. Joy did not erase suffering here. It coexisted with it. What moved him most was how people carried each other. A neighbor caring for a sick parent with patience that bordered on sacred. A young man working 2 jobs and still showing up to help repair a roof for someone else. A family who had little, yet insisted on sharing. Their strength was quiet, but unbreakable. Richard had seen power in boardrooms and influence in politics, but this was different. This was moral strength. And somewhere between shared meals and shared silence, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Belonging. Not because he fit in, but because he was accepted as he was. There were no expectations placed on him, no identity demanded. He was not asked what he did, what he owned, or who he knew. He was simply there, and that was enough. One night, sitting outside under dim streetlights, listening to distant laughter and prayer, Richard finally admitted the truth to himself. The world he came from had taught him to chase control. This place taught him surrender. The Philippines was not trying to impress him. It was not trying to prove anything. And that was precisely why it shattered everything he thought he knew. He whispered the words to no one in particular, yet they felt heavy with meaning. I have never seen this anywhere else. Not the kindness alone, not the faith alone, but the way they were woven into daily life, inseparable from identity. This country had taken a man who believed generosity followed wealth and shown him something far more powerful. That humanity survives and even flourishes when people choose each other. For the first time in years, Richard was no longer searching for the next place to go. He was exactly where he needed to be. Richard did not announce his departure. There was no closing ceremony, no revelation of who he truly was, no dramatic unveiling of wealth that would reframe every act of kindness he had received. In fact, that was the point. The experience was never meant to be validated by status. It stood on its own, complete and untouched. When the time came for him to leave, he felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest, not relief, but reluctance. This place had not simply helped him survive a few difficult weeks. It had quietly taught him how to live again. He realized something profound in those final days. Back home, life had always felt like a negotiation. Time for money, attention for influence, kindness for recognition. Here, none of that applied. People gave without calculation. Faith anchored them when circumstances offered no comfort. Families remained intact, not because life was easy, but because love was non-negotiable. The Philippines had not offered him charity. It had offered him humanity. For the first time, Richard understood that strength does not announce itself loudly. It does not dominate headlines or financial markets. True strength kneels beside suffering and stays. It shares food when it barely has enough. It smiles not because life is kind, but because hope is chosen anyway. That realization followed him everywhere, in every goodbye, every quiet nod, every prayer whispered on his behalf by people who expected nothing in return. When he finally returned to the world he once ruled so confidently, everything felt different. Boardrooms felt colder. Conversations felt rushed. Acts of generosity felt strategic. And yet, instead of bitterness, he carried clarity. The Philippines had restored something he did not know he had lost: his faith in people, his belief that goodness can exist without incentive, his understanding that wealth is not what you accumulate, but what you are willing to give when no one is watching. This was no longer just his story. It became a message that stretched far beyond one man, one journey, one country. In a world fractured by division, suspicion, and exhaustion, the Philippines stands quietly as a reminder that compassion is not obsolete, that faith can still guide daily life, that resilience does not harden the heart, it opens it wider. For Filipinos watching this, there is something deeply important to recognize. What the world often overlooks, what it sometimes underestimates, is precisely what makes this nation extraordinary. The values passed down through generations, the unshakable belief in God even when answers are delayed, the instinct to help first and ask later. These are not weaknesses, they are gifts, and they matter more now than ever. For those watching from outside, this story is not an invitation to pity. It is an invitation to respect, to learn, to question assumptions about success and value. The Philippines does not need saving. It offers saving, not in the way the world usually defines it, but in the way the soul recognizes immediately. Richard never spoke publicly about what he experienced in detail. He did not need to. The change was evident in how he lived afterward, in the causes he supported quietly, in the way he listened more and spoke less. Some journeys are not meant to be advertised. They are meant to be honored. And perhaps that is the final truth this story leaves behind. That in a time when the world feels loud and fractured, the most powerful lessons often come from places that simply choose to love again and again without applause.